In music, as well as in life, first impressions are generally pretty important for establishing a mental image of something, whether that be a person, company, or in this case, a game series. With this in mind, it becomes clear how important the first few pieces of music we hear in a game really are, as they help to form this mental image derived from our first impressions. Composers therefore face a massive challenge when approaching this task, as they need to write music that both fits with the beginning of a game, while also being aware of the potential of that music to become a focal point in establishing a game series' identity. With a masterful composer like Nobuo Uematsu, he makes it seem easy with two of the pieces we're going to look at today in this video, both of which went on to become musical hallmarks of that series. I am, of course, talking about the Final Fantasy Prelude and Main Theme. Let's dive in. The Prelude is perhaps the most iconic of all the music featured in the Final Fantasy series, being present in more or less every game in that series. Being titled Prelude, as you would expect, it tends to appear at the beginning of most games before the gameplay even begins, and while it has been morphed and rearranged plenty of times over the years, there are a few key elements that stay consistent no matter which iteration of the theme you are listening to. We'll start by looking at the original version of this theme from all the way back in 1987. Probably the most distinct element is the wide arpeggio figure that plays throughout the piece, which definitively identifies the music as the Final Fantasy Prelude with just the first few bars. Instead of basic triad arpeggios, the notes outline a slightly more colourful chord progression of. There is a heavy focus on the added ninth scale degree, its inclusion in most of the arpeggios helping to create that magical and peaceful feeling that pervades the music throughout. With the final two chords in the progression, we can see the introduction of mode mixture through the use of the G-flat major 7 chord coming from the parallel key of B-flat minor, the pieces in B-flat major. This injects another colour into the music as we extend the cadence of the progression by 2 chords instead of moving directly back to our home chord of B-flat from the F chord in a perfect cadence. The other thing I should mention is that we see an instance of the good old Mario cadence. I feel like I talk about that way too much, but then again it is so commonly used after all. With the inclusion of this, we get 2 cadential movements in sequence to really increase the strength and motion of the chord progression back to the tonic chord. So now that we've looked at the original version and have an idea of the distinct elements that make up its composition, let's next look at how Uematsu changed the theme to accompany 2 other games in the Final Fantasy series. I should mention that the first version of this theme to introduce melodic content alongside the arpeggio figure was Final Fantasy IV, released on the Super Nintendo in 1991. The prelude from Final Fantasy VI begins with the arpeggio figure established in the first game in its entirety, before we reach the melodic section containing new material that we haven't yet seen. To strengthen the harmony, we have some lush string pads fleshing out each chord underneath the melody, played by a flute. The melody itself targets chord tones within each chord with a strong focus on the tonic note of C. Even the counter line at the end of each phrase circles around the note C with neighbour tones to strongly draw the melodic conclusion of each phrase back to the tonic. Using melodic writing that resolves back to the tonic on the strong beats of the bar creates a very stable melody with strong harmonic direction at the loss of some harmonic colour, as many of the instruments play only chord tones found within these basic triads. While the strong notes and resolutions of the melody tend to fall on the note C, due to the slow phrase length, we do get more decorations to the harmony from the composite of both the harmonic and melodic instruments. In the second bar of this section, we get 2 minims, or half notes if you're American, on the note B and D, adding the 7th and 9th to the underlying C major chord. These colours are also added to the A minor harmony in bars 3, 4, 7 and 8 through the counter line, introducing the 9th and 11th to the chord structure. With the F and G chords, the only real change of note is both chords have now been revoiced to root position, strongly anchoring these chords in place and helping outline the bass motion of F, G, A flat and then B flat. The melodic writing over the G chord does feature a quick passing tone of C and beat 4 to connect the B and D in the melody. When we approach the A flat major 7 chord, due to the mode mixture from C minor, the melody does change to include the note E flat rather than E natural, while still focusing much of the melodic resolution on the tonic of C. The melodic contour of the last 4 bars includes a 6-5 suspension, followed by a melodic walk down to the third of each chord. With the B flat major 7, this means the final note held in the melody is a D, setting up a 2:1 or 9:8 melodic resolution for when the music loops, wrapping up the music with a really strong melodic resolution. With Final Fantasy VII, the prelude starts identically, the only change from Final Fantasy VI being the use of what sounds like an FM synthesizer playing the arpeggio figure to replace the harp samples used previously. In terms of structure, again this version is almost identical to the Final Fantasy VI one, the only real difference is being the change of instrument upon repeat of the melodic section and a short 4-bar coda added to the end before the music loops. In contrast to the Final Fantasy VI version though, the melody here is harmonised in thirds throughout with a slightly different counterline at the end of each phrase. The leading voice in the melody is changed from a flute to the oboe, as the whole first repeat of this melodic section features heavy use of woodwinds, including the counterlines played on a clarinet. As opposed to both the original and Final Fantasy VI, the harmony of the final two chords in the progression is altered to include the sixth, making these chords A flat 6-9 and B flat 6-9. The sixth of each chord is held in the top voice and the string part as well to create more colour in the harmony. Upon the second repeat, the melody is shifted to brass, with the French horns taking the melody in thirds again, and the upper harmony is also played by the strings of woodwind. The counterline at the end of each phrase also disappears, leaving only the final note in each phrase closing out bars 4 and 8. As we reach the final new section of the piece, we resolve back to the tonic C add 9 chord from the B flat 6-9 and set up a loop of music with an additional 2 bars. The harmony moves to a 4 minor 6 chord in the form of F minor 6, the minor 4 chord or minor plagal cadence, often being used to evoke a bittersweet feeling in music written in a major key. This closes out with a G7 sus4 chord, a dominant function chord to set up strong movement back to the tonic for the loop, altered from the standard G7 chord to add more colour and retain strong melodic and harmonic focus on the tonic note of C. So by looking at 3 differing versions of this iconic theme, we can both see the musical evolution and development of the material that will become key aspects in this piece of music. The dreamlike atmosphere of the wide arpeggios from the original version being supplemented with melodic material in Final Fantasy VI, then the alteration of said melodic material with a final coda section in Final Fantasy VII. These new ideas introduced with each version of the prelude develop the piece over time while still retaining the original qualities that make this piece iconic in gaming as a whole. From the simple 3-voice NES to the orchestral sampling of the PS1, the core aspects of the music always remain and are surrounded by new ideas Uematsu introduces with each successive version of this theme. The piece that is often called the main theme of the Final Fantasy series ironically tends to appear as a credit sequence piece in the more recent games, contrasting its original intent at the beginning of the first Final Fantasy. The structure and overall tone of the piece, however, do stay consistent over the many different iterations appearing across countless Final Fantasy games throughout the years, being almost national anthem-esque to my ears. Like the prelude, let's start by looking at the original version of this piece from the first Final Fantasy game. The theme is broken into 2 main sections, with both being much more distinctly classical, in air quotations, in compositional style than what was typical of NES games in the era. The first important compositional trait is the use of primarily stepwise motion in the bass voice, a strong trait of classical composition, and provides a defined sense of motion while maintaining smooth movement between chords. The use of a secondary dominant leading to the 5 chord is also a fairly key characteristic of the piece, outlining a strong cadence back to the tonic chord at the top. The melodic content in this main theme primarily features chord tones in the melody with the use of 6/5 and 4/3 suspensions as they are referred to in classical analysis. This is supplemented with a counterline which moves to fill out the inner voices and provide more harmonic content to each chord as fully as possible, with the limit of really 3 melodic voices on the NES hardware. The final melodic trope is the lack of any real syncopation in the melody, the vast majority of the notes falling on the beat. This is another characteristic of the more classical compositional style, with syncopation really only becoming part of the compositional toolkit with the onset of ragtime jazz in the early 20th century. The B section then introduces much more harmonic colour to the music, with the gradual introduction of more interesting harmonic movements and chords from outside the home key. The use of both the flat 3 and the flat 6 chords serving as a nice contrast to the primarily 5/1 movement that pervaded the music to this point. While I kept all of the analysis in the home key of F major, the music does toy with differing key centers throughout, the most obvious one being G minor, with the continuous appearance of a D7 chord creating strong cadential motion back towards that G minor chord. The piece, however, does tend to move back to F major tonality relatively quickly, leaving these harmonic excursions as purely instances of colour rather than full-fledged modulations. In contrast to the continual development and adaptation of the musical material present in the Prelude, the identity of the Final Fantasy main theme has remained relatively unchanged throughout the series' history, the only new ideas really being the addition of differing sections at the end of the piece, usually as a means of closing out a credits sequence. From Final Fantasy VI, the first obvious change is the key of B-flat major, which isn't really significant in any way, but it is worth pointing out even the subtle changes to the music. The first big difference, however, occurs almost immediately, with the harmony much more filled out with 4-part writing in contrast to the original's 3-voice writing, a limitation brought on by the NES hardware. The chord progression and movement of the original piece is almost fully preserved in this version, with flourishes of colour present in differing chords throughout the progression, such as the use of a G augmented chord in bar 6 to create stronger motion in comparison to the G7 towards the following C minor chord. The arrangement also begins with much more closed voice chords played by strings in the SATB chorale style, before the repeat of the melody enters an octave higher to expand the vertical scale of the music and build up the arrangement. So with the exception of the more full chord voicing and the odd change to the underlying harmony, the A section of the theme in Final Fantasy VI pretty much stays completely faithful to the original in both compositional style and arrangement. However, when we move to the B section, we can see the introduction of more elements to diversify the music while maintaining the identity of the piece as a whole. The B section features a much more mobile bass line in comparison to the original version of the piece, creating plenty of slash chords in the harmony to accommodate the bass motion. In general, the harmonic motion is also much busier in this section of the piece, with some bars containing a different chord on every beat, brought on by the fuller 4-part harmony and bass motion. Even with all this added colour to the music, however, the underlying parent chord progression remains pretty much the same throughout, just like it's been dressed up in fancier clothing by comparison to the original piece. The entirety of the first time through the theme it's played only by strings, but when we reach the end of where I've transcribed here, we do return and repeat the theme in its entirety, with fuller instrumentation and the introduction of other sections of the orchestra, such as brass and percussion. This serves to build up the music to the climax of the credits, with the introduction of a new final section to close both the music and that credit sequence out with a bang, something we'll touch on more in Final Fantasy VII. Just like the version from Final Fantasy VI, the Final Fantasy VII version of the main theme appears during the credits as the final closing musical idea before the game ends. Much of the content in this version of the theme comes directly from the preceding one, with slight changes to the way the music is presented in terms of instrumentation and structure. Let's take a look now. We're back to the original key of F major in contrast to Final Fantasy VI, and that's really only the notable difference between the two pieces. Stylistically, we still stick with the SATB form of 4-part harmony played by strings, with even the octave doubling of the melody returning on the repeat, this time played by a flute rather than more strings. Some of the harmonic colour has been slightly altered from the Final Fantasy VI iteration. For example, the secondary dominant G augmented chord is replaced with a diminished 7 on the cadence halfway through the first section. Subtle differences like this don't create any massive difference in the music, just alter the colour perceived by the listener in a fresh way that is different from the preceding piece. Like Final Fantasy VI, with the move to the B section, we can see the introduction of more instruments to help fill out the texture and increase the sense of grandeur that the music aims for. Much of the stepwise bass motion that was present in Final Fantasy VI is replaced with more stable chord tones underneath each chord, anchoring the harmony in place while still creating some motion in the parts. This idea continues throughout the B section until we reach the final cadence that brings us back to the beginning of the theme. The music is then repeated in its entirety again, with no real harmonic or melodic change, only the introduction of more instruments, again filling out the texture, and percussion to drive the music forward and introduce clear motion towards the end of the piece. Once we reach the end of the theme on the repeat, we enter an extended coda section used primarily to prolong the resolution of the music and build towards a strong climax. This begins with a horn fanfare echoing the first melodic statement in the theme before we enter a build-up, specifically stretching out the resolution to the tonic F chord with a series of flat 6 to flat 7 chord movements. The new high string ostinato helps drive towards the approaching climax, while the brass and bass outline static chord harmony underneath. After 2 run-throughs of this harmonic motion, the music explodes into the climax on the tonic F chord with a sudden tempo change and further string ostinato. The bass motion between 5 and 1 is a very common way of closing out music from the classical period, while the use of a flat 7 dominant 9 chord introduces the more modern musical flair common in video game music of that era. The string part outlines a Mixolydian flat 6 scale, a nice and interesting colour to contrast the static harmonic motion and draw attention to the fact that this is the finale of both the game and the musical score, which is ended with one final Mario cadence. The flat 7 chord, however, is underscored in the bass with the 5th scale degree, the note C, creating a 5 minor 7 chord overall for a subtle change to this repeated chord progression. After a brief pause, we end on a low tonic drone of the note F. Again, one more very classical element to end a piece on, and draws this entire musical journey to an end with a massive bang. So once again, after analysing 3 different variations of this iconic Final Fantasy piece, we can see the evolution of the music from chiptune to the late 90s MIDI orchestra epic. Like the Prelude, once the key musical ideas tied to the composition of the piece were established, they stayed relatively consistent as integral to the identity of this piece of music as a whole. The classically inspired SATB writing and strong harmonic motion were highlighted in all versions of the theme we looked at and embellished with differing coda sections to bring the piece to a grandiose close when present as part of the credits. Clearly we can see that Uematsu always had a clear vision for what the implications and emotions of this theme would be, even when he wrote the simplified original all the way back in 1987 for the first Final Fantasy on the NES. The initial idea I brought forward at the beginning of this video was all about first impressions and the effect they have on us as human beings. The creation of an identity and distinct traits were all things I discussed as being important in any form of media, whether it's visual art or music. After this analysis, I think it's safe to say that Nobuo Uematsu more than succeeded in creating a strong and distinct identity for the Final Fantasy series through his composition and continual development of the music. You know what they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and clearly even with all the advancements in console gaming and music technology, the prevalence of both the prelude and main theme of the Final Fantasy series show how true this statement is. Hopefully you now understand the importance of strong thematic material in game music as part of a series' identity and have a new appreciation for the people who put these scores together. Anyway, thanks for watching. Until the next video.